Hi everyone, today we're presenting our project on racial linguistics and the cultural representation in English language for newcomers in Canada. Before going into our topic, let's watch an interview.
Before coming to Canada, what is your first image of the Canadian culture? Canadian culture? I didn't know anything about Indigenous people. I was really surprised when I first attended class and this professor did a land acknowledgement thing. I was like, what the hell is this? Yeah. And I became more conscious and serious about the importance of land acknowledgement as I became more familiar with the history, culture, tradition, everything.
So, who gets to choose to define what it means to be Canadian in an ESL or ELL context? And does this reflect the real diverse history of Canada, including the Indigenous peoples and the incorporation of racialized communities? Or does this in turn create ratiolinguistic and racialized profiling, the idea of us versus them, and does it create a systematically harmful institutional education for newcomers in Canada? Our question is whether English teaching materials effectively promote the true representation of Canada through English language education for newcomers, and what or who do they leave out of these educational materials? You may be wondering, what's the relevance to this topic? When we present a narrow view of what it means to be Canadian, we risk out the many cultures and communities that Canada makes up today. When considering Indigenous peoples of Canada, the history of colonialism, and how these histories are or are not represented in English language materials newcomers use to learn about Canada. This planner here is what I used in grade 6. What you see inside is former prime ministers, historical figures, and geographies of Canada. What they don't or subtly mention is the Indigenous presence, acknowledgement of land, the use of proper Indigenous terms such as Aboriginal, and the lack of social and cultural groups it leaves out, such as gender ideology, immigration, multiculturalism, and Indigenous lands and rights. Christina Cole explains that Indigenous perspectives and reconciliation education was met with reluctance and resistance in ESL and EAL among educators in Canada, while public universities in Canada responded with incorporating Indigenous land acknowledgements and perspectives. ESL curricula was met with resistance. This is because teachers in ESL classrooms either had no knowledge or very little qualifications to teach Indigenous education, or that they thought that Indigenous culture and self-determination education was not important for ESL classrooms. Who gets to choose what it means to be Canadian in education textbooks? Well, Gulliver from a 2010 study found that out of 24 textbooks that were used for English language teaching for ESL students, they found that these textbooks shaped the perception of Canadian identity, patriotism, gender, and racial ideologies.
Success stories in ESL textbook suggest that speaking correct English is enough to belong, but proper English is neutral. It depends on who's doing the listening. A newcomer can speak fluent, grammatically correct English and still be heard as speaking bad English, not because how they speak, but because of who is speaking. Kubota calls this epistemological wisdom knowledge system that decides whose voice counts as legitimate. You see it in Canadian EFL materials. A 366-page newcomer textbook never mentions Indigenous. The teacher resources place Indigenous events next to Christmas as just another festival. This isn't new when Canada defines its official languages. Indigenous languages were pushed aside as personal choice, while English and French became the founding languages. Kubota correctly limits this to the 1960 framework of two founding races, and the same hierarchy still decides whose English counts as legitimate today, the white box, and visible standards built around white native English speaker. This connects back to a story from earlier in the course at Villemont, a Cantonese Canadian in an ESL class who struggled with translanguaging and his placement stripped away his Cantonese heritage language. This shows how ELT systems can actively function as a tool of linguistic colonization. Discouraging translanguaging positions most heritage language as something to overcome, which limited his ability to build identity and self-efficacy in the ESL context. This raises a bigger question: how does translanguaging ideology actually operate or fail to operate in the EFL pedagogy? Garcia in 2009 distinguished addictive bilingualism from dynamic translanguaging. Forrest and Rosa argued that mainstream culture praises bilingualism as a cognitive advantage, yet when racialized students naturally mixed languages, school read it as a disability rather than a skill. So, how do we break down this colonial legacy? McDonald offers the idea of 0 point and the part of undoing that is recognizing Indigenous languages as a founding, not supplementary. This actually starts here. Canada's first Indigenous immersion program is widely regarded as one of the most successful heritage language teaching models, and it didn't stay just Canadian, it's to globe. Indigenous scholars in Aotearoa, in New Zealand and Hawaii have looked into this same approach in their own language revitalization work. So through Raciolinguistics lenses, what does decolonization actually look like in Canada? 4 things. Introduce more critical approaches to teaching content, expose the colonial function apt in multicultural discourse, that translanguaging empowers students' linguistic repertoire, and make bias countable, not just felt.
To conclude, newcomers should not leave their linguistic and cultural identities behind when learning English, but utilize and take advantage of the translanguage repertoire to embrace the new Canadian identity and way of life. Viewing language education through a racial-linguistic lens reveals that classrooms do far more than teach just grammar and accuracy. They define identity, sense of belonging, the image of Canada, and who gets to choose to define what it means to be Canadian, and which cultural and social groups may be discriminated against as a result. The question for English educators and policymakers is not about what English to teach, but whose Canada are we choosing to build and represent in order to avoid racial linguistic prejudice.
This is our reference. Thank you for watching.